Maverick.
Yeah.
You hear about ice?
What's that?
You want another one?
Really?
Yeah.
I feel the need.
The need for speed.
Ow!
By the summer of 2012, Tony Scott, the adrenaline-fueled director behind Top Gun, True Romance, and Man on Fire, was still very much a man in motion. He was busy at work developing a sequel to Top Gun with Tom Cruise and Paramount Studios, scouting locations and preparing to kick off production in 2013. He was also in the early stages of producing a crime thriller titled Lucky Strike starring Vince Vaughn. Although approaching 70, you couldn't tell by looking at his packed IMDb profile, which showed Scott remained a go-to force in the world of high-octane studio filmmaking. But beneath the professional momentum, there were signs that something wasn't right. Friends described Scott as more withdrawn in his final months. Though still meticulous and intense on set, there was a heaviness to him that some close to the director later admitted they hadn't fully understood at the time. To many, it appeared Tony had begun quietly grappling with the emotional toll of decades in a high-pressure industry and the creeping weight of a personal darkness that he kept from most around him. He was a man known for explosive cinematic set pieces and kinetic energy, but behind the camera, he was described by colleagues as deeply thoughtful, often intense, and at times painfully private. But if there was a creeping darkness or at least a quiet introspective side to the director, it rarely showed up in his movies. In many ways, Scott redefined what an action movie could be. Films like Enemy of the State, Deja Vu, and Unstoppable weren't just thrill rides. They were character-driven, stylized portraits of people under pressure, often drenched in moral complexity, that deepened the projects beyond the average action movies of the era. Tony Scott wasn't merely a hollow, high-octane showman like Michael Bay, or even a master stylist relying on slow-motion gunfights like John Woo. Many of his contemporaries were preoccupied with spectacle and pushing the boundaries of visual effects or leaning too heavily on the star power of muscled-up action stars like Schwarzenegger and Stallone. Scott, though, was no slouch in that department, and certainly didn't make boring films, but his films have stood the test of time because he was after something deeper than your average popcorn summer movie. He championed actors and gave space to them to perform in movies that might otherwise be dismissed as genre fare. And with True Romance, written by a then-unknown Quentin Tarantino, he proved he could balance grindhouse aesthetics with genuine emotional tenderness. But even though he was widely respected and continued to thrive in the cutthroat film industry well into the new millennium, Scott was battling something that even his enviable professional success and acclaim couldn't conquer. And on the afternoon of August 19, 2012, Scott drove to the Vincent Thomas Bridge in San Pedro, California, just outside of Los Angeles. Surveillance footage would later show him parking his car, calmly exiting the vehicle, and climbing a fence before jumping into the water 185 feet below. He left behind several notes for family and friends in his office and car, but the mystery of what drove one of the most successful directors in Hollywood history to his final moments was just beginning. Tony Scott was 68 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Tony Scott.
News of Tony Scott's death rocked Hollywood, and authorities quickly launched an investigation into the circumstances surrounding his fatal jump from the Vincent Thomas Bridge in Los Angeles. Eyewitnesses reported seeing Scott climb a fence along the edge of the bridge's pedestrian walkway and leap into the water below without hesitation. His body was recovered by a dive team several hours later. Law enforcement found multiple notes in his car parked nearby, one containing emergency contact information, and others in his office addressed to family and close friends. The letters, according to investigators, did not reference any foul play or external factors and were interpreted as farewell messages, solidifying the belief that the act was intentional. The LA County Coroner's Office later released its official report, stating that Scott had indeed died by suicide. The official cause of death was listed as multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high-impact fall. Toxicology tests revealed that Scott had therapeutic levels of the sleep aid Lunesta and the antidepressant mirtazapine in his system, both prescribed medications, but no illegal substances or alcohol were found. Rumors initially circulated that Scott had been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, possibly explaining his decision, but his family and the coroner publicly denied the rumors, confirming that no such illness was found during the autopsy. The investigation concluded that there was no evidence of foul play, solidifying the ruling of suicide that left many in his inner circle grappling with questions about what he had been going through privately.
Yeah, this was a big deal in Hollywood. He was a very big director. I mean, Tony Scott was not just the brother of Ridley Scott. He had a whole career, Top Gun,
Best
all
friends
the
with Tom
movies.
Cruise, famously running buddies kind of thing.
But he was very, very private.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Steven Spielberg type or Martin Scorsese, who are these ambassadors to the film industry and are less private individuals. Tony Scott just did his work, released his films, and let them speak for themselves. He was a very private guy. So his death was sudden and very unexplained.
Sudden, unexplained, and I think it goes to his private nature that he is less well known than many directors who have not been nearly as impactful in Hollywood. He directed Top Gun and Days of Thunder and so many of the other sort of classics of the 80s and 90s that he should be one of the most famous directors of our time, but he's not. He's famous.
Sure.
But he's no Spielberg. He's no Scorsese. He's no Tarantino. He's no Ridley Scott, even.
He's no Ridley Scott, even his brother.
They play in the same sandbox in the same corner, right, his own brother, but he's far less well known, but his movies are equally as famous.
Yeah, it was very sad. There's no cult of personality around Tony Scott, but the reaction from Hollywood and the film community was swift and emotional. Social media was flooded with tributes from actors, directors, and producers who lauded Tony not just as a master of the action genre, but as a generous and exacting artist who made stars feel safe even in the chaos of his signature pyrotechnics. Tom Cruise, who collaborated with Scott on Top Gun and Days of Thunder and considered him a close friend, released a heartfelt statement, calling him, quote, a creative visionary, and adding, quote, Tony was my dear friend, and I will really miss him. Denzel Washington, a frequent collaborator who starred in 5 of Scott's films, including Man on Fire and Deja Vu, said he was a brilliant filmmaker and added that he made you feel like you could do anything. Directors such as Ron Howard, Edgar Wright, and Joe Carnahan praised Scott's style and generosity, noting that his energy on set was matched only by his loyalty to actors and crew.
Tony Scott's funeral was held in L.A. in a private ceremony attended by close family and longtime collaborators. There was no red carpet, no spectacle, just a quiet farewell to a director who preferred to let the work speak louder than the man himself. While there was no elaborate memorial service broadcast publicly, the industry honored Scott in quieter but deeply meaningful ways. At the 2013 Academy Awards, Scott was featured in the annual In Memoriam segment, where his name and image appeared alongside other industry legends who had passed that year. While the tribute was brief, the moment drew loud applause from the audience, a reflection of the deep respect he had earned across genres and generations. Many felt the Oscars could have done more to honor his specific legacy in action cinema, a genre still too often overlooked by major award bodies, though his impact on commercial filmmaking was never in doubt.
In the years since his death, Tony Scott's reputation has only grown as filmmakers have continued to cite him as a major influence on modern cinematic style. His relentless pacing, stylized visuals, and emotional storytelling helped evolve the blockbuster formula. In interviews, stars and crew members alike often reflect not only on his professionalism, but also on his enthusiasm, warmth, and generosity behind the scenes. His death remains one of the most tragic losses in recent Hollywood history, not just because of how he died, but because of what he created during his lifetime and what he still might have created in the future. And what a body of work it was. Scott brought visual velocity and stylistic bravado to action filmmaking. With his distinct use of saturated color, rapid edits, and visceral camera movement, he helped transform the blockbuster into an art form that merged physical spectacle with emotional urgency. Tony Scott's cinematic style was explosive, kinetic, and emotionally charged, a distinct visual language that redefined what audiences came to expect from action films and thrillers. His approach was less about subtlety and more about visceral immersion. With a background in painting and advertising, Scott brought a hyper-stylized, almost impressionistic sensibility to the screen. Saturated colors, rapid edits, smoky lighting, and a signature blend of chaos and control. His films didn't just show tension slowly building like the work of his brother Ridley Scott in classics like Alien and Blade Runner. Tony's movies had a pulse. Scott's camera was constantly in motion, chasing adrenaline, often placing the viewer directly into the firestorm of whatever emotional or physical crisis the characters were facing.
His breakout film, Top Gun, in 1986, wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon that launched Tom Cruise into superstardom and reshaped the language of blockbuster filmmaking. Derek, I always think about this movie. It's one of my favorites. I mean, it was at the time of my life when I was a kid, and it just was everything. And I loved the sequel as well, which obviously Tony Scott wasn't a part of. And I think what makes it great is it could have just been a simple military recruitment film, but he made it something more, this glossy, macho ballet of jet engines, bromance, aerial bravado. Talk about the film's aesthetic a little bit. It just really, he sort of did something that nobody else had done before in terms of making the skies. I mean, I don't want to be too cliche about it, kind of come alive, and it was really amazing.
Yeah, it's a combination of the soundtrack and the blue skies and the volleyball sequences and the jet engines. I mean, this is what 80s cinema was. You had the Stallones and the Schwarzeneggers doing their muscled up action heroes. Tom Cruise wasn't that. So it's really, he knew he had a different type of superstar, and he makes the jets sort of the featured players, and you hear the rumbling, and you hear they're on those aircraft carriers, and that's a character in and of itself.
Yeah. There are two scenes in that movie which could have come across as so hokey: the volleyball scene, and then the awkward makeout scene between Tom Cruise and Kelly McGillis. Tom Cruise is one of the great actors ever, but he's not like a guy who has a lot of chemistry with his leading women a lot.
Rarely.
And so you have these two scenes, right? Let's talk about the volleyball scene. It's so like slow motion, dude shirtless, so hokey, but it's one of the most famous scenes in movie history. And I think that's all in the director, right?
I agree
It's not
completely.
the script. It's not the producing. It's all in the director to make that not be really goofy and awful.
And we sort of joke about it now because they're oiled up, they're on the volleyball court. It's got homoerotic overtones. There's no doubt about it. It's similar to the sort of Rocky sequence of him running on the beach with Apollo Creed. People joke about it now, but at the time, as well as I do, it was cool. It was considered cool. They had on their aviator shades.
Yeah.
We now laugh at it because we're in this
playing
sort of
volleyball in jeans.
That's right. They're playing volleyball in jeans, shirtless but in jeans. And in our sort of post-ironic way, we laugh at a scene like that. But at the time, you have to understand, in the 80s, those guys were the coolest.
And so he leaves the volleyball scene. Tom Cruise says he's got to go. Like, Maverick, got to stay because he's got to go see Kelly McGillis. So he drives his bike over to Kelly McGillis. He walks in. She's like, "You're late." He goes, "I'm sorry. Can I take a shower?" And she looks at him and she goes, "No."
It's silly now,
silly.
but it was very cool.
He pulled it
off. And he would reunite with Cruise in Days of Thunder in 1990, a NASCAR drama that leaned into a similar stylistic playbook: fast cuts, intense close-ups, and stylized movements, cementing their partnership as a shorthand for cinematic speed and masculine charisma.
Although Scott could have continued cashing enormous checks with action movies through the 80s and 90s, his next big project shattered expectations and set his career on a different course, and played a critical role in introducing the film world to one of the most important directors of the next generation. True Romance, released in 1993, stands as one of Tony Scott's most beloved and influential films, an audacious collision of pop violence, operatic romance, and razor-sharp dialogue that helped bridge the gap between slick Hollywood spectacle and indie grit.
Working from an early script by Quentin Tarantino, who was still largely unknown at the time despite the underground success of Reservoir Dogs, and still a year away from his masterpiece Pulp Fiction, Scott brought a stylized, emotionally charged visual flair that softened some of the script's more nihilistic elements while amplifying its pulpy energy. The film, starring Christian Slater and Patricia Arquette as star-crossed lovers on the run, became a cult favorite, lauded for its bold structure, unforgettable characters, and iconic supporting performances from the likes of Gary Oldman, Dennis Hopper, and Christopher Walken.
Do you know who I am, Mr. Woolley?
I give up. Who are you?
The Antichrist. You got me in a vendetta kind of mood. You tell the angels in heaven you never seen evil so singularly personified as you did in the face of the man who killed you. My name is Vincent Kirkcaldy. I work as consul for Mr. Blue Boyle, the man your son stole from.
You can hear that crackling dialogue of early Tarantino in nearly every scene, but it's the raw and visceral direction of Scott that shapes how we digest these words. You can almost see how Scott's visual flair in True Romance played a direct role in influencing how Tarantino himself would cast and direct his features in the future, beginning with Pulp Fiction the very next year. A lot of people think Tarantino has a unique and sort of ineffable style all his own. But when you watch True Romance, that's not Tarantino's direction. That is Tony Scott. And it's Tarantino's script combined with that visual palette that became the eventual sort of what you think of Tarantino.
I'm so glad you brought up this and focused on this movie because it is a departure for Tony Scott, right? It is not the...
It ain't Top Gun.
Action. It's not Top Gun. And Ridley Scott, who he's often compared, his brother, it's not Ridley Scott. It's not explosions. It's not,
it's not quiet menace like Alien or anything like that.
But you're right. It is his transition into the Tarantino world. And he helped create what Tarantino became in not just Pulp Fiction, but you have Inglourious Basterds, one of my and your favorite movies of all time. And going forward, Tony Scott's fingerprints are all over Tarantino's directing style and obviously served him very well.
Yeah, and by the way, Tarantino doesn't shy away from this.
No.
It's out as if he thinks Tony Scott helped create the way he wanted to tell stories in the future. And for Tarantino, True Romance was a crucial breakthrough in his career, proof that his voice could translate to the screen, even through the filter of a commercial director like Tony Scott. And for cinema, it represented a new kind of genre-bending storytelling, raw, romantic, brutal, and oddly hopeful, that would come to define much of the 90s.
Top Gun made him famous in the 80s, and True Romance solidified his bona fides as a true cinematic artist in the 90s. But it was Tony Scott's collaborations with Denzel Washington in the 2000s that revealed the deeper, more emotionally complex side. Their 5 films together form one of the most enduring actor-director partnerships in modern cinema. In Man on Fire in 2004, Washington played a burned-out ex-CIA operative seeking redemption through the protection of a young girl in Mexico City.
What's going on?
That's what I want to know. What is going on? Huh, Sam? Let me ask your wife a couple of questions, okay? You move. You make one sound. I'll snatch the life right out of you, understand?
The film was a turning point for Scott, stylistically aggressive, yes, but also deeply melancholic. His use of jittery handheld camera work, jump cuts, and layered subtitles was experimental for the genre, reflecting his inner fragmentation of Washington's character. Man on Fire was not just about revenge, it was about pain, loss, and moral rebirth, themes Scott had rarely explored so directly before. Scott and Washington continued to push boundaries with Deja Vu in 2006, a time travel thriller that was as philosophically ambitious as it was action-packed. Again, Scott's style was both cerebral and sensory, using disorienting visual techniques to stimulate the bending of time and memory. And with his train-themed tandem of The Taking of Pelham 123 in 2009 and Unstoppable in 2010, the two exploded post-9/11 American fears and heroism through working-class characters. Unstoppable, Scott's final film before his death, was a triumph of tension, pacing, and emotional clarity. It was a stripped-down story about an unmanned train loaded with hazardous materials, but under Scott's direction, it became a relentless ride with real human stakes, anchored by Washington's grounded, empathetic performance.
I love this phase of Tony Scott.
I like the movie, too. Unstoppable was one of my faves.
It's phenomenal. And as a capstone to his career, it's really worthy. I love this phase, though, because Denzel Washington is such a different actor than Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is a very good actor. Denzel Washington is one of the finest actors ever. Yeah. You know, he just really is. And Tony Scott knew how to use him as well, and he really folded in a lot more of the melancholy. You know, you can't get that. You can't get there in Top Gun with Tom Cruise, that element.
Tom Cruise is amazing also, but he's straight action all the time. Denzel Washington is that building tension, that ire, especially in Man on Fire. He's got that anger seething behind his eyes. Smoldering. Tom Cruise doesn't do that.
Right.
It's very different. And Tony Scott got the best out of both of them. They both loved him, Denzel and Tom Cruise. So obviously, talented guy, deals with multiple different types of talented actors.
Absolutely. And throughout his career, Scott helped redefine what action cinema could be, not just spectacle, but story through sensation. He understood that editing and color were emotional tools, not just aesthetic choices. His films, while often panned by critics for being overly stylized or noisy at the time of their release, have aged remarkably well in an era of chaotic but hollow blockbuster filmmaking. Directors like Michael Bay, David Leitch, and even Christopher Nolan have borrowed liberally from Scott's visual grammar. And unlike many action directors, Scott was fiercely loyal to his actors, giving them room to explore pain, moral ambiguity, and transformation within genre frameworks. Beyond the visual style, Scott's influence lies in his ability to elevate pulp into poetry. He consistently delivered commercially successful films that didn't sacrifice intelligence for thrills. And you can really see this in the Denzel Washington period. They're thrilling films, but they have a depth to them in that action genre that you don't often see in Michael Bay movies. He had a painter's eye like his brother Ridley, but a bruiser's instinct, blending art house techniques with multiplex appeal. His frequent collaborations with screenwriters like Shane Black and Quentin Tarantino allowed him to explore more complex characters and themes under the guise of genre.
Tony Scott's death was a devastating loss to cinema. In retrospect, his body of work reads like a fever dream of American masculinity, trauma, redemption, and motion, a catalog of films that pulse with urgency but never lose sight of the human soul at their center. and it's impossible to not wonder what he might have brought to the long-awaited Top Gun sequel, which Scott was working on at the time of his death, but was eventually helmed by another standout in the action genre, Joseph Kosinski, before hitting theaters a decade after Scott's passing. Top Gun Maverick is a magnificent movie, steeped in 80s-style action but modernized enough to be more than a pure nostalgia play. Kosinski did an incredible job, but it's fitting that the film was dedicated to the memory of Tony Scott, an acknowledgement that the sequel would have never been possible without the stylistic DNA he left behind in every frame of the original.
And nearly 13 years after his death, Scott's influence remains deeply felt in Hollywood. Directors like Michael Bay, Catherine Bigelow, and David Leitch have cited his visual dynamism and narrative pacing as foundational to their approach. But Tony Scott didn't chase awards and industry recognition. He wasn't always favored by critics, but he knew how to make movies that move people, fast, loud, emotionally charged, and unforgettable. In many ways, his style was the antithesis of his brother Ridley Scott, whose best films have often been lauded for their meticulous visual composition, futuristic set designs, and the use of eerie silences and subtle camera movements to build tension in classics like Alien and Blade Runner. Tony eschewed the chilly detachment of his brother, carving out his own unique style, focused on massive spectacles, hyperkinetic camera movements, raw and rhythmically charged set pieces, and intense protagonists with a restless energy to match his storytelling style. There's no doubt that Ridley is considered the finer talent, a critical darling who many credit with satisfying the commercial demands of Hollywood without sacrificing the artistry of filmmaking. For much of his career, Tony was often derided as simply feeding the beast, making movies that earn big bucks for studios but don't necessarily stand up artistically. And yet both men made films that have stood the test of time. And so I thought it only fitting to give the final word to one of the most respected and iconoclastic filmmakers of the modern era and one of the biggest fans of Tony Scott, Quentin Tarantino, heard here reflecting on the often overlooked importance of Tony Scott's work and how his reputation as one of the most important innovators in action cinema has finally been redeemed in the years following his death.
After Tony died, I rewatched all of his movies like within a 2-week period. Well, I mean, look, I'm here to tell you, there was a time in the 80s, it was not cool to like Tony Scott. I mean, he was denigrated. All right. Oh, Ridley was the one. He's just the commercial hack. Screw this. And I was fighting all by myself. And one of the really great things is in the last 25 years, his reputation has, finally caught up with his success.